Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evolving Enneagram's Interspiritual Podcast. I'm Reverend Nhien, founder of Evolving Enneagram, and I am so excited to be in the midst of a Transformation by Type interview series in which we're interviewing Enneagram professionals, not about their work per se, but about their own personal and spiritual journeys with the Enneagram. So I am so delighted to have with me here today a colleague and friend, Shawn Ellison, here to share about his journey. Shawn is an Enneagram professional located in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is close to, getting his spiritual direction certification in the Carmelite tradition. And so not only is he an Enneagram coach, but also an integral coach, is my understanding, and a Christian contemplative. So welcome, Shawn.
Hi, Nhien. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, very great to see you again. So for context, like many during COVID, I first met Shawn through the internet. During these COVID days. This is how most of us met. So we have yet to see each other in person, maybe soon, because San Francisco's Enneagram conference is coming soon. I'll be over in the Bay Area. So I pray, if it's meant to be, we shall see each other.
I might be there. We'll see.
Okay, that would be fantastic, because I got to tell you all, I saw some of Shawn's posts on Instagram. I'm like, who is this guy? Like the depth of your post, Bernadette Roberts, I think some of these quotes that I was reading, and so we scheduled a Zoom about a year ago, and I just remember, when I'm on Zoom with you, I feel like I vibrate differently. There is this feeling, this resonance, and this depth, and this quality of being that I hold very dear. So I'm very, very grateful to have Shawn, you here with us today.
Thank you.
So I'd love to start by inviting you to share with us first, just basic context of how you met the Enneagram and learned your type.
Yes. So I met the Enneagram about 5 years ago, actually, in a coaching program. And our coaching mentors wanted us to have some type of track for our own development. And so the Enneagram was brought forth as a tool to facilitate that. And at that point in time, I had heard of the Enneagram, but I had not explored it. So that sounds interesting. So now was the time to really explore what this was all about. And initially, when I took some tests they gave us, it was a really bad test, by the way, and most online tests are terrible. And I typed as a 5. And they didn't have the eye to really see that that wasn't my real type. They didn't question it. They didn't try to affirm it, or try to track the motivational system of my type. They just kind of said, okay, you're a 5, and this is what we're going to work with for the year.
Oh, wow.
And when I graduated, I continued studying on my own. And I took another test by a teacher named Captain Fauber. And her test is very different from most tests. She spends so much time almost perfecting it. She has these hidden markers in the test that scans for motivation in a very different way. And I took her test, and I came back as a 5 again. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. On the bottom of her test, there's a little annotation, and it says, FYI, you're probably a 6. And I was like, what? And so I'm like, okay, that's kind of random. And so I thought I have to go talk to this lady to see what this test is all about. And so I scheduled to see her on Zoom, and we spoke for about 2 hours. And within the first 10 minutes, she's like, you're not a 5, you are a 6. And she began to explain to me what that was. And as she was explaining to me what 6 was, I was like, whoa, she is on par with the truth. And that's how I discovered the Enneagram. And that's how my journey as a 6 really began consciously, because I had so many spiritual experiences prior to that without the Enneagram being a lens. that I used. And so once I learned that about myself, I began to sort of retrospectively look at my whole spiritual life from the context of six. And it made such profound sense.
Wow. Wow. Well, I would love to hear you share about some of the spiritual experiences that you had prior to meeting the Enneagram. We'll just start with that. I'll try not to ask compound questions. Like we'll start with that. And then the overlay, of the Enneagram on that. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I started my journey very early. I was 15 when I began to begin the spiritual journey. And it was sort of ushered in by a death in my life. And so one of my best friends was murdered when I was 15. And that shook me so much. She was a very saintly person. Her whole family was murdered by a stranger. And our high school was devastated by it. I was very shaken by it. And I began asking very existential questions to myself. I was terrified of death, terrified of my own mortality, terrified of everything. And as a six, you see threats and dangers everywhere. And being a little six, just anxious, I had a lot of panic attacks, and I was just a very anxious person when I was very young. And after she died, I was sitting in her church, and she was Catholic, and I was actually Protestant at the time. And in her church, I received this interior impression, and it wasn't a word per se. It was like an impression, and the impression was, "Give your life to me. You belong to me."
Wow.
And it hit me very subtly, and I felt it. And from that moment on, I knew I had to move on in this journey because my parents were very devout Protestants. I mean, we were feeding the homeless every week. We were going to church every Sunday. We were having Bible study 3 times a week. We were having worship services. I mean, we were very devout. But I wasn't really interested really in seeking God at that point. I was sort of observing what was going on. And my friend died. I knew that I had to really get on the track, if you will. And so I said to my mom and dad, I said, "Hey, I have to get baptized. I need to get baptized immediately." And so within weeks of her death, I got baptized. And in my baptism, I had a very profound mystical experience. And in that experience, my sense of individuality fell away. And in that moment, there was this blissful cosmic dimensionality. There was this vastness, this I amness that literally radiated from the depths of my soul. And I was mesmerized. My brain stopped. At least it felt that way. It was this sense of being seized and held in this unity. And at the time, I left the pool and I was disoriented. And I was like, I don't know, I couldn't even think. And so for the first few minutes, I couldn't think. And after my thoughts came back and the experience sort of contracted and I was back to my little ego self again, my first thought was, what was that? Right? I had never heard of that experience, never heard anyone describe it. And so I was going home that day from the retreat that I went to. And my whole purpose was, I have to find out what that was. I have to devote my life to prayer, and I have to give my life to God so that I can experience that again. So that was my first initial sort of Christian mystical experience, this experience of oneness, of unity that didn't last long, but it was a glimpse into what was possible. And that was really the start or the initiation, I would say, of my Christian mystical journey.
Yeah, so profound. First of all, so sorry for the loss of your friend and her family. And I mean, these, this is a tragedy that sounds like it just like impacted an entire community, right? And like rocked a paradigm, if you will, of life.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, what struck me about it is how these are the moments, right, when people either turn way away from the divine, like they're like,
Right.
well, clearly there is no God because this happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that opening also creates this like precious room, and sometimes that room is made by grace, by pure grace, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds
Mm-hmm.
like also a kind of receptivity in you, even as you described sickness. I feel like sometimes it is actually, ironically, the egoic structure of I'm small in this world that
Mm-hmm.
allows like the bigness of this divine presence to
Mhm.
even be like received, if you will. So interesting. Yeah.
Mhm.
So thank you for sharing that. And also understanding the structure. I think a lot of times when we meet the Enneagram, there is that like understanding of your story in a new way. For you to describe this anxious little boy, if you will, I'm like,
Mhm.
wow, like I haven't really felt him in you, in your presence here today. I imagine that, transcend and include like that he was within you, but there's a difference between how that affect, like more, whether it is what leads, so
Right,
yeah.
right. It's
Yeah.
interesting, yeah, because looking back, Nhien, I recognize that I sought God to manage my fear,
Mm.
right? I felt small, I felt inconsequential, I felt lost, and I needed support, I needed guidance. And really, initially, the motivation was to manage fear, it was to find certainty in the midst of mystery, tragedy. And of course, throughout our journey, the divine purifies our motivations. But initially, in the human journey, we have these sort of self-invested interest, and when it comes to God, and I recognize that looking back, that I was just as I felt powerless. This sense of being helpless and not knowing what to do, or am I next? Am I going to die next? Or if I die, what's going to happen to me? So all these existential burning questions. And so that was a really strong impetus for me to seek God in the beginning, for sure. And I see the six working in that way very clearly.
Yeah, thank you for that clarity. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, so you were
Hmm.
about to share the next stage in terms of your
Yes, yes, yes. So the next year and a half, I was like a monk. And so I would go to school, I would come home, and I would pray for hours. I would read scripture, I would meditate, and I didn't have any formal instruction when it comes to mysticism or contemplation. I never heard of those terms. I was very foreign to those terms. I grew up in the Black church. And so all I really knew was sort of like loud worship and
loud worship.
drums banging and shouting, and which there's a place for that. But for me, something was shifting in my journey. So as I began to pray, my prayers at this time were very supplicative. It was like,
Mhm.
God, show me yourself. God, I want to know who you are. God, who am I to you? You know, Prayers like that. So they were prayers that were based on revelation. I was like, I want you to reveal yourself to me. I experienced you without a doubt those couple years ago, and now I'm dry and I don't know what to do. So really, I came from a place of humility. I didn't know how to approach God. I didn't know, how to pray. And so after about a year and a half, I noticed a change in my prayer. And so I would go into prayer, I would start speaking to God, and then suddenly I would fall into silence. And in the silence, there was no thought. There was no sense of, thinking or, even being in a room. I went into this very interior place and I got scared. I was like, what is this? And I would kind of resist it. I would kind of pull myself out of it. And in the Protestant tradition, for most people, the idle mind is the devil's playground, and that's what I was told. You can't be in idleness, that's dangerous, right? So I had these questions about it. What was that? Silence, this stillness. But I knew that there was something positive about it. I walked away more peaceful. My nervous system relaxed. I felt at ease with myself. And I knew that there was something about it that was positive. And so sixes are very intuitive as well. And I recognize that there is something here for me that is unconventional, that is very unorthodox from what I'm used to. I
Mm.
have to trust that. And I didn't know what that was. So here's faith sort of beginning to activate itself. I have to trust that. And so what happened was I said, okay, I'll go into prayer and whatever happens, happens. And so I went into prayer and I would fall into silence for 30 minutes to an hour. And I would come out of it and I felt this very deep sense of peace that would pervade my whole being. And then one day things got really weird. And so I was working at an auto mechanic and I was like a janitor slash assistant. And I was sweeping the floor. And out of the blue, I felt this hold on my being that kind of pulled me so interior. I began to lose consciousness. So I'm sweeping the floor and I'm starting to like lean over and kind of black out. And my boss is right behind me. He's like, Shawn, what are you doing? And I was like, kind of snapped out of it. And I was like, oh, sorry, I don't know what happened there, right? So I try to get composure. And I thought, what was that? This sense of losing consciousness in the middle of the day. It was summertime and I'm wide awake. And all of a sudden I'm blacking out. And so I go home that day and I'm like, okay, I got to sit down and let this experience unfold. So I sat down because I had been resisting this pull all day. And I sat down on the couch in my house and I let go. And I felt myself descending to this numinous space within myself, losing consciousness again. And as I got to the point of almost complete blackout, my father came in from the side door in the basement and he startled me and I began crying. My father's like, come here, son, what's wrong? So I got up and he gave me this really tight hug and he said, son, what's wrong? And I said, I don't know. I was like, I don't know what's wrong. But I knew something was happening to me. Something's happened. God is working in a very mysterious way. And so I knew that I had to go upstairs in my house that night, lock the door, and literally have no interruptions. I've been interrupted twice at that point. And so what happens next is what I call my mystical conversion. Because once this happened, I was never the same again. It was like God literally picked me up and placed me in this other dimension, and I could not go back. And so I was in prayer that night. I'm sitting there, I'm reading Pentecost and in the book of Acts, and I felt there was something powerful coming, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I'm sitting, in the lowest position on the bed, and I see like this foggy, cloudy substance come into the room visually.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, am I losing my mind at this point? How is there a foggy, cloudy presence in the room? But it was there, I saw it. As I'm sitting there, I'm holding my breath, and there's like this foggy presence coming into the room, and it surrounds me on all sides. And I'm holding my breath, and I'm looking around, and I'm like, I'm sick, so I'm like, am I going to die? Is this it? And then suddenly, I felt this descent, this penetration from the top of the crown, and just kind of came this way. Wow. With like such a force. I felt like blunted by this. And as soon as it hit the head, I was immediately disoriented. Like I was hit with a blunt object. And as this hit my head, it traveled vertically down into me. Wow. And it had such a feeling of a rush. It's like a comet, like sweeping through me. And it was coming down. And I'm at this point overwhelmed because my brain literally stopped. It didn't stop, but it felt that way. And as it's traveling down, this immense force, I don't really want to call it a force, and it hits the midsection of my body, and I felt like this reverberation, like this crack, which I now know was Kundalini awakening in me. And then this rush going up the spine, going way up past my throat. I began speaking this unknown tongue, which I had never done before. And it goes up through my eyes and out my head. And at that point, I ceased to exist. And so there was no sense of being a person, no sense of individuality, no sense of being in a body, no sense of time or space, of being alive, of existing in any shape or form. It was complete annihilation. And all that was in that other space was complete transcendent silence and emptiness. And I don't know how long I was in that space, so to speak, but then there was this contraction. So I reappeared, and like a balloon filling up with divine air, it's like I blew up and then I ceased to exist. The balloon reappears and I'm contracting now with the same violence that I went up. Wow. And so as it's contracting, there's like this sense of almost incarnation, where it's like you have divinity collapsing on itself and it's coming back into the body and it hits the center of my chest. And at the point of that, it contracted again and exploded into this divine joy, this bliss, this euphoria. And I'm like looking at my hands and my feet. I'm like shaking, trembling, I'm convulsing, I'm crying, this overwhelming presence. And I'm like, my mind is like, first, how am I alive? How am I not dead? But I was so dimensionally confused because I was just in some other dimension. Now I'm back in this dimension. So I was kind of betwixt two dimensions. And as I'm sitting here with this experience, this utter radiant joy and bliss and power even, I got to get up off this bed because so much has happened. I got to get my body moving. So I get up and I just collapse on the ground because my
Wow.
body felt so light. It was like I was weightless, like I lost the power of my body. I began to get up slowly off the ground to kind of reconfigure my limbs. And I'm walking. I get to the living room. My brother, it was summertime, and my brother was on the computer and he saw me. And I was so distraught and overwhelmed by this. I couldn't speak. He was
Mm.
like, Shawn, what's going on? What's going on? And I tried to speak. I couldn't speak. I was mute. And so I went down to the basement where our room was, and I got in my bed and I curled up in the fetal position. And I'm crying, crying, crying. And this radiant bliss, this waves, this like endless waves of bliss. And my brother's like sitting across from me, just kind of waiting for me to speak. And after about maybe 15 minutes, I said, God, God. And he kind of shook his head like, oh, that's what this is. And at that point in time, I thought to myself, I would go to bed tonight and wake up in my normal state. I would never again experience this. This is a once in a lifetime experience or encounter. So I go to bed and I wake up the next morning and it's still there. That imminent presence of God. It was burning like a flame in the center of my soul. And when that happened in the end, my whole life shifted. This is a shift to St. Teresa's fourth mansion, which is
Mm.
the mansion of infused contemplation. God picks you up from where you were, puts you in this new mansion, and now you're in this infused state of receiving from God directly. And that was a mystical conversion. I was never the same again. And I don't even know, to be honest with you, where I would be today without that experience. It was that pivotal. It was that formative for me. And once that happened, the whole entire mystical journey unfolded from that point. So I can kind of pause there. But that was the moment where my life literally went from a switch was turned and I was never the same. Never.
Wow. Wow. What a profound journey. And I so appreciate you sharing it for multiple reasons. One is I'm literally like goosebumps the whole time you're sharing. There's just an aliveness that I feel in response to your share. But also, I have a few questions, but I think also what's important about you sharing that story to me is how many people are alone in their mystical experiences, who might be questioning their own sanity, if you will, and who
Mm-hmm.
don't kind of have a place or a person, someone to go to for support in that. You were fortunate to have a family that even is grounded in a religious tradition that recognizes that there could be something happening bigger than us, right? And that's not true for everyone who has these. There are people who come to my, evolving Enneagram ministry work in a way where they're like, I've had this like oneness experience. I don't really know what to do about it because I don't have church, right? So I think this is particularly helpful for those who not only who have had these experiences, but for others to really get a glimpse of one way it might look, right? That there is this, we talk a lot, or I talk a lot about dying to who we were, dying to who we thought we were, and that journey is very tricky when we merely talk about it, because the egoic structure of the personality might take charge and be like, okay, well, I'll let go of that, and as you describe it, I think it feels more like I am shaken out of that. I am literally like, it's a little
Yes.
bit more like, here, we'll just
Oh,
shake
yeah.
it out of you.
Oh, yes.
And,
Yes.
you
Quite
can just
violently.
fall to the ground, figure out how to stand back up. Okay. It's not, hey, let me think about what dying means. Like,
Right.
yeah. And availability to it is key. Like, you made the space, right? You went to your room, you went into, your interiority. And that is important for that journey of like, that we are called, and it's our choice whether to like open to that experience. Yeah. One thing, when you were describing this annihilation of self, it struck me. I'm like, well, how did you know? Like,
Mhm.
after, I mean, I think this was after the Kundalini awakening,
Mhm.
and and you kind of went into this sort of amorphous like state, if you will, is how I read it. Was there awareness? And so what does that mean, that I wasn't not a self anymore, but I had awareness, or else how could I experience that presence, right? Yeah, so I have a question about that.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, also to clarify, when I went through that, I was very alone, actually.
Oh,
My parents were like, this is the devil. This is not.
oh wow.
Yeah, so I went through that whole thing. My father was very cynical. He was
Oh,
like, oh, this could be the devil, son. I'm like, oh, okay. You don't get it. My mother, very supportive. But the next day, Nhien, I went out and bought 25 books online to understand this. I began Googling things. What happened, right? That's where I found Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross. I began reading these things, and I began to understand, oh, this is a whole tradition. This is something that has been long here before me. So I think when I began to read and study, that really took away the isolation. It was knowing that I'm in this tradition that is so sacred, that God has called me into this mystical dimension, and that in that I'm not alone, even though I could feel that way from those around me. So I just kind of clarify that. But yes, and so with that experience, and it began happening daily as well. So after that happened, every day I would go into prayer and be annihilated. That was the prayer. Teresa calls this the prayer of ecstatic union, which is the prayer where essentially God suspends self-consciousness. And really, you don't go anywhere. Really the subjective sense of going someplace, that's a real sensation. Like she calls it rapture too. It's like the sense of the soul fleeing the body, but it's not really going anywhere. It's more so a subjective feeling. But what you know is the absence of self. That's what you know. And in that absence, there's silence and stillness. And in that absence, something is seen, right? St. John of the Cross talks about the beatific vision, right? It's seeing the Trinity, it's seeing the whole Godhead without looking away. And in that vision, all else disappears, all else falls away. And really, that experience is like a death experience, because you die to yourself to see God. And my question to myself was, how did I see God face to face and live? But that was the question, because what saw God was not me. It wasn't self that saw God, right? It's more like God seeing itself, right? This is so transpersonal, right? Going beyond the personal, that really the line where you disappear is where you end. That's where memory stops. What you know in the next state is more like a revelation. There's something that is revealed to you from within God itself, and you weren't in it. You didn't participate in that. It's only when that ends and you suddenly come back to yourself, do you suddenly realize that, one, I vanished. I don't know where I went, but yet when I vanished, there was something revealed to my soul, right? There was something that happened there in that space. And it's very clear, it's unequivocal. There's a conviction about it. And for sixes, we don't have much conviction by nature. And so we're questioning things. So the very fact that there was such conviction, like I know what I saw, right, was such a powerful anchor for the six.
Wow. Yes. Yes. And for those who are listening who are newer to the Enneagram, one thing I want to highlight is, Shawn shared earlier about his journey of initially being mistyped as a 5. And I just want to say that the Enneagram is rooted more in motivation than behavior. And 5s and 6s both research a lot. They can. Like that behavior. People are like, oh, if you're a researcher, you must be a 5. Like kind of is really a superficial notion like of the Enneagram. Plenty of 6s that act in what we call 5-ish ways. But truthfully, I want to say it's not a 5-ish way. It's actually part of being 6. Like it can be. It's a potential expression of the need for security and certainty that is embedded in the type structure of the 6. And then you also connect as a self-preservation 6. And it's because it's funny. It's like I've been in situations where I should have been in fear of my life, but I wasn't. And it's self-preservation is like my lowest. And so just to be clear, like that thought that just does. I actually had another interview with self-preservation 7 Milton, and it was like he described a situation. He was like, yeah, I was stuffing my mouth with food. I was like, that's never in my story. Like eating is never like when I tell the story. No food, preservation. So just a few little things that I noticed when I talk to people of different like dominant like instincts. So
Right, right.
yeah. So what else do I want to share about? Related to this, kind of bringing it back to the Enneagram momentarily here. What you spoke about reminds me of so core to the Enneagram Type 6 personality structure is what we call the passion of the type, sometimes called the vice of the type. Again, this is old Christian language that people are like, oh, it's so sinful, but it is fear for the 6. And the virtue, as I understand it, is courage, right? It can be described in many ways. So what I heard is when you talk about conversion, it felt like there was a conversion into, okay, let me go take a step back. When a personality type 6 is rooted in an identity based on fear, there is a tendency, as you touched on, to second guess everything, right? It's like it drops inside. It's like, I can't trust that, but I need to trust it. I can't trust myself. And then I go outside and I'm looking for sources of security. You talked about looking for security outside yourself. But I need it, but I'm not sure if I could trust it. And so there's never certainty from the personality of the 6. And thankfully, we are not our Enneagram types. We are not our personalities. But it does, like, there is this moment, I think, in many Enneagram spiritual journeys of a kind of conversion in which that realization takes place. So I'd love to hear you speak a bit about that movement. So courage, that kind of like, there's a groundedness and a substantiality, and you translate it in one way as conviction, right? Ground of being that is felt as an experience and not as an idea that you reach for, right? Yeah. So I'd love to hear just more about your personal relationship to the vice and the virtue type.
Yeah. So starting at 17, when I went through that experience, courage became such a touchstone for my progression, because these experiences intensified over the next 4 years. And so there were so many times, Nhien, where I was like, I should be hospitalized. I shouldn't be walking around in this world functioning, right? Because there was so much psychic energy. And I think for head types, there's this fear of chaos, this fear of disorder, mental, just mental insanity is a fear. And it feels very real to you, when you're walking around and you have all these experiences and you're trying to hold it together. You're going to college and you got your friends and all these things, and yet you have all these experiences. And for me, I'll be sitting at lunch and then I'll get up and just run out. You're like, where did he go? And I'm like, if I don't run out from right now, I'm going to black out on this table. It's not going to be a pleasant sight. And so there was this sense of needing courage to move these experiences. And in time, what I learned was that the spiritual life is not about experiences. And I think for me, and as a 6, I needed that. And it's funny how you talk about what God gives us that we need. As a 6 that doubts everything, that questions everything, I wouldn't have understood this mystical life without experiences, right? God, I got to give you this so that you can at least believe, at least have understanding, and then we can work on taking you out of that stuff. But I recognize that people say, oh, I don't have those experiences. We may not need them, right? 6s sometimes need that. They need that experiential contact on that level. I mean, it was a Teresian sort of journey, where it's like I was having visions and hearing voices and having raptures, and it was like a roller coaster for 4 years, nonstop, Nhien. And it was really tough. And there were times where I thought that I should be hospitalized. I wasn't. But I didn't have any spiritual direction. I didn't have any coaches. I didn't have anything. I had these books and myself and my courage. I recognize now that I look back and I think to myself, how do you survive that? Because it was such an intense period in my life. And I think looking back now is like, you take for granted the amount of courage that was needed
Oh,
in that time frame. So kind of look back to my younger self, like, you know what, you had so much courage,
oh,
to go through these
yay. Rooting for yourself
experiences,
here.
rooting for yourself. Like, whoa, it was like this stuff
Oh,
was, I can't explain to you, even really articulate how it's almost like your whole structure is falling apart,
yeah.
and yet you got to keep going, and like you're moving, and God is like, there's so much grace coming in, and like the walls of yourself are cracking, and it's like you see it, and it's like, but you got to trust that you won't fall apart. And so you're kind of walking through life, and you're walking like this fragile thing, but you don't fall apart. It's like, I think I'm going to fall apart, but I don't. And there's that sustaining grace that's in the background of all of this as well. And so when I was 21, I went through this really big dark night of the soul experience where all of my experiences of God vanished, everything, a complete wipeout. And when that occurred, I was like, what happened? Right? No, I had read about the Dark Night from St. John, and I knew that it was a thing. But for me, I thought, I'm too young. I was like, I'm only 21 years old. I can't go through this. So they were 30 something, they were 40 something. I need another 15 years of experiences to get to that point. And God's like, no, you're ready. Right. And I was in that for about a year and a half. And after the year and a half, there was this resurrection to a new state of being. And that resurrection is what we call the unitive state. It's a sense of our abiding oneness with God that never wavers. It's this passive, autonomous awareness. And so you are as aware of God as you are of yourself. There's no distinction. It's really like an indistinct union where self and God run into each other like that, and it can't be separated anymore. And so there's no more seeking, no more even praying. Even it's like you live this, you breathe this. And when that occurred, my fear, right, and my fixation, which is cowardice, right, that divine center that's revealed in that resurrection, it literally unifies the whole self, so that the passion dissolves and the fixation dissolves. And in that, courage really steps forward as the dominant experience, right? Holy faith, right? My holy idea comes online. And when that occurs, there's a sense of liberation, right? Like you're no longer held down by this sense of being a type, right? You're not that, as you mentioned. You're this interior presence of God that you can't see yourself out of. And at that point, your whole life changes, because now the six becomes heroic. It becomes
Yay.
this, I mean, I won't say you're reckless, but you're fearless, which is, and it's not as a counterphobic thing. It's more so true fearlessness. It's like God and I are together. And it's like, to want to support. When that becomes permanent for you, it's almost like you're infused with this strength, right? And Captain Farber talks about this a lot. She said sixes are very strong, but you don't know it. You don't know how strong you are. And yet, on the higher side of the six, there's this innate strength that you feel. It's like you're like steel, and you're like, oh my God, it's like I'm invulnerable. And you step into life with such courage. It's a beautiful state to be in, because I think each type will experience something similar with that type of unitive experience. Like their virtue takes over, and the holy idea takes over, and now you're a whole different expression of your type.
Wow. Okay. So much there. For those, again, a little bit newer to the Enneagram, one way of defining type might be there's a particular passion, also known as vice, that is characteristic. It's the emotional habit of your type. And we talked about that being fear for the six. So what Shawn just talked about is that there is also a mental habit. And that mental habit for the six is known as cowardice, right? So the idea is that when in fixation, you've got a mental fixation and you've got an emotional habit that kind of loop together. So fear and cowardice being kind of like a view of a paradigm. It's interesting. They think of it as worldview. I also think of it as God view. It's like it's a way we view the world, like through a lens of like danger and like I'm small and like watching out and forecasting against danger to protect that little self that's alone in the world, kind of energy from the mind. And again, this is my framework for it. And that move that is gifted to us through the journey. We could do the little legwork, whatever it is, the consent, but the gift is the shift or conversion to the virtue. Again, we talked about the virtue being courage, but Shawn also mentioned that there's a shift to the holy ideas, and it's almost like the higher mental state, which is a combination historically of holy faith and holy strength. So mentally, those two holy ideas sort of combine together. And my understanding of that is that holy faith is like, it's the knowing of a ground of being. And yes, not just a ground that you stand on, but that in a way that you are. That there's an inseparability with that ground of being, and that the contact and connection with that ground of being offers holy strength, which is, it's like the endurance of faith, like a steadfastness of faith.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I see some resonance with that. Like, and so what I hear is that journey where it's not the egoic enactment of mustering, courage. It's
Mm-hmm.
stepping forth from a place. And I would say that at a place like that, it seems to me that even courage disappears, right? Because what you described when you talked about fearlessness, is for me well, courage is only necessary, in my view, from the egoic standpoint of when there's something to fear and I'm going to brave through it. But when I'm connected to a ground of being and thus am fearless, there's a way in which, yes, it looks like courage, and yet courage is not even necessary. There is
Mm-hmm.
just an innateness of fearlessness, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
kind of an
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's really, really well said. Yeah, and it's interesting about it is that, there's this sense that if I fall down, I'm supported, right? And so there's no sense of even a fear of falling, right? It's like if I fall down on God. So let me just live my life.
Yes, yes. Oh,
Yes.
you reminded me. And one thing I wanted to say that is really important, or invite you to speak on, is when you talked about this invincibility, if you will, like this being still. I want to be careful, because I think a lot of times when we talk about the spiritual journey, there's a little confusion. Does that mean you don't lock your door, Shawn? Like, does that like, so let's talk about that distinction and what like invincibility, what that means to you, that being like steel. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that, and this is, so that happened over 10 years ago. Things have changed since then. But
Okay.
well, what I would say then was that it was really the experience of knowing that I'm protected by God, that we are a team. Because this unitive experience, it implies a duality. We say that unitive, right? They're two things coming together. But when they come together, it causes a union of likeness, if you will, a union of wills. So your will and God's will literally coalesce together. And in that coalescing, there's a strength. Because now when you're living your life, it's almost like everything is ordered by God, and you know it. And so really the invincibility, the sense of being steel, is more like my faith in God is such that I don't have to worry about anything anymore. Whereas before, you're worrying all the time, worrying about every little thing as a six. I mean, you walk out the door and it's like, did the zoo burn down? Now there's a lion on the street. Like, it's like really weird stuff. But sixes do think those kind of things. And even my wife says, you have a big imagination. And I'm like, I do, right? But it's funny because when you think about just six maturing more and more, there's this sense of like, I can just be and I'll be okay, right? There's no sense of having to check things out or like, have to double check things, be cynical, be skeptical. It's more so a sense of a deep trust in life, a deep trust in God. And that doesn't override common sense, right? Like you say, you're not going to, run a red light. Oh, I'm fine. I'm not going to get hit by a car, or I'm not going to, it's more so this sense of apatheia almost, where it's like, it's a beautiful word, apatheia, that is sort of like your emotional center is so grounded in God that equanimity becomes your default position inwardly. And that equanimity is what really liberates you to just be open, right? To be in this pure receptivity place, I would say. So yeah, initially there's this thing of being, I'm still, but as you live it, it becomes natural. So you don't think about it anymore. It's like, it's only in contrast, right, to your previous state. So it's all relative. So in the beginning, it's like, oh, I'm still. Then like 5 years later, you're like, oh, this is just life. And I'm just living it and it's okay. And so really, I think as we journey and evolve, we have contrast, but over time, the contrast fades. And as you get more and more into unitive being, there's no contrast. There's just what is. And so there's kind of steps and stages to this as well.
Yes. So we have just about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure to address something that you mentioned, which is the dark night of the soul, because you have talked about these experiences of great blessing and grace that I think many of us, I'll speak for myself, that we eagerly await, and probably too eagerly, and so I would love to hear as well about some of your dark night journey, and even the role the Enneagram plays in that you see.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that back. Yeah, so there are many dark nights, right? There's a dark night of the sense that John talks about, is when our images of God fall away and begin to kind of open up to more of an apophatic knowing of God that's not based on positive images, right? There's a dark night of the soul or spirit, and that's more like a interior collapse, right? The ego collapses on itself. And in that collapse, the divine is revealed as our true center of being. And there's also a dark night of self, which comes after that or before. It's not linear, it can kind of happen in different orders. But the dark night of self. So I went through this dark night 7 years ago. And so here I am living this beautiful unitive state with God, right? And all of a sudden that disappears. And it's like this subject object union vanishes. And when that happened to me, Nhien, I had not saw that coming. I read the Dark Night of the Soul part. It was okay, I see that coming. But this one I didn't see coming. And so when that happened to me, there's a sense of being lost, which is true to all dark nights, of being lost because your previous self-referencing disappears or is changed or altered. And so I went through this experience where I disidentified with my doership or with my agency. It was a sense of, I'm not Shawn. I'm not, the person that thinks or feels or knows or wills, right? A complete dissociation from any type of identification of being me. And when that happened, it's like, well, you're walking around like, I don't have an identity. I don't have a personality. You're kind of just lost. And when that happens, I realized that the type structure is so interesting to me. The type structure is such that these dark nights re-trigger it, right? It's something that you notice as a defense strategy. And so when I went through that, I really saw more than before how the type structure is a defense strategy against the unknown. And when you lose your sense of self, all you got is your defense strategy, it's your type structure. And so my type structure, which I thought was unified and all this stuff, was still there. But I recognized the fact that in the unitive state, it compensated for a lot of the structure's sort of inadequacies. But without that compensation, the type structure was still there, standing on its own. And having saw that, I was like, I thought I was healed and transformed and everything. You kind of recognize that this unitive state, it holds the whole thing together. That's the whole idea of unity. It holds it together. But if you and God disappear, nothing holds it together anymore. It's just there by itself, standing. And there you kind of confront this primordial avoidance, which is fear itself, right? There's a fear of fear itself. And I went through this journey of having to, how do I navigate a life where I have no self, right? Literally no self, no sense of self. And my wife even recognized there's something different about you. Like, I don't see my husband anymore. What's going on here? And it's an adjustment. And this dark night of the self, what happens here, just to kind of wrap it up pretty quickly, is that the infinite consciousness from the background moves to the foreground, so that your identity, your type structure falls to the background. And when that happens, a switch. where now you feel immense, right? Not I, but a vastness comes on you, a wideness. This is not unitive. This is more cosmic. This is more like an Eastern Atman experience, where it's like, I am that, right? Or before Abraham was, I am, right? This wide I amness takes over. And so the different dark nights, and each one yields a different result. But I would say the most recent one really ushered in how do you navigate life without even having a mind? Because the mind splits away from it, and all of a sudden it's like pure presence. And so it's a process of learning how to acclimate to the unknown. And I think all of us have to do that on some level.
Yikes. So,
It's terrible,
okay.
yes.
Oh, something to look forward to, everybody, as you journey. No, oh my God. I could just talk for so long with you about this. As you were describing that final piece, again, I know it's not the final piece for today. I almost I love this notion because how do I say this? For me, we never lose our Enneagram type is at least my story for now, that throughout this lifetime, that it's part of this particular identity that we have. The difference is we don't identify with our type. And when you were describing like what leads, what goes in the front, I mean, and this idea that it's almost like, what is master of the house, right? Like originally type is master of my house. It's what drives, it's the CEO,
Right.
and there's something about, well, every quality, to me, my notion of unity is that everything is contained. So there's nothing wrong or bad. It's aspects of being. It's about whether they lead or whether they don't lead. But like they're not gone, right? Like they exist in this totality or unity or oneness of the cosmos, if you will. And again, this is my particular metaphysics, if you will. And so when you describe that, I was like, for me, there's something in which each type, it feels to me like offers a gift to the world, very much based on your particular point on the Enneagram, right? Through your expression of courage, and courage that has moved through fear in a very unique and precious way in the world. And that there is a beauty as part of that spectrum of the rainbow of life that is unique to each person as they enter through that kind of archetypal structure of type, and yet transmute its constriction, if you will. And so it is not bound within type, but freed with special accessibility to that point, if you will, because that's what it feels like, right? That each of us, even as we kind of open, evolve, expand, and I love that definition as well, this idea that that type is not bad. It's a prison, it's fixation. It's, as you repeatedly said, a sense of constriction versus expansion, right? Like this, yeah. So I wanted to name that. And gosh, I really want to know how you and your wife navigated that.
I'm married to an 8. So that was really interesting.
Yeah. Any quick tidbits about like how you it's just like, this is okay. The book says this is gonna be all right. Is that
Right, right. Well, she's also a psychotherapist too, which is interesting. Yeah, so when I went through that latter dark night, she said, I don't know how to talk to you, because I don't feel a presence here. You're like a void almost. Like I don't know who's here. And hearing that is like, there's still a human here. So sort of like, oh, that seems terrible, to experience something like that. So what I told her was that, even though the self that she knew is gone, the soul is still here, right? The self has fallen off, but the soul is still here. And that soul was always present, right? It's now in the front, and the self has fallen off. And so I said, sense into his soul, into Shawn's soul, and you'll find him there. And for whatever reason, that shifted for her, that she learned how to relate to me from a soul level and not like a personality or self level. And that's kind of how we began navigating this most recent change.
Amazing. Well, I might need to interview her next time. Give her a say. No. Well, again, I need to have you back at some point, but I just would love to close this time with any counsel that you might have for the new to the journey 6 in terms of like the spiritual path for the 6. If you have any wise words to share.
Yeah. I think being a 6 is so hard. And I know every type can say that, I'm sure. But I do think that 6s, when you fear everything, you don't trust yourself, life is especially challenging and difficult. And I would say that for a young 6 on this journey, I found that the more vulnerable you can be with yourself and your experience, the more receptivity there is to grace. In other words, the more deeply human you can be. 6s tend to rationalize, project away, and not really own what's happening, right? Like, I am actually afraid. I actually feel fear. This is what I'm actually feeling, and that's okay. And I think it's really owning the fear that invites the grace in, because the grace comes in and it begins to transform that fear into courage. But it's not until we actually own the fear, really deeply own it, really be with it, not turn away from it, that I think the grace can kind of come in and flood us, begin to transform that into something different. So that's what I would offer for any young 6 out there.
Thank you so much, Shawn. Any closing words for us, a prayer or?
I have a beautiful quote from Bernadette Roberts, who's my favorite Christian contemplative. We think of ourselves as originally emerging from the unknown, from darkness, nothingness, or non-existence, into the light of consciousness. But as consciousness develops, we discover the increasing ability to see in the dark, see into the nothingness or mystery of ourselves, and eventually realize that this darkness and nothingness is the divine from which we emerged and with which we are one. Thus, we discover that our original darkness is true light.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nhien. It's been a pleasure.
So great to have you here. Until next time.
Until next time.